Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those cats were fast as lightning. And in fact, it was a little bit frightening. But they fought with expert timing. They were funky Chinamen from funky Chinatown. They were chopping them up. They were chopping them down.
Oh!
Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I have a confession to make. I have never seen a single Karate Kid movie. I'm sure that's going to come as a shock to a lot of folks, at least in my generational cohort, just like it's a shock to me whenever I'm doom-watching movie reaction channels on YouTube and realizing just how many people my age have, never seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit or Jurassic Park or Twister. Meanwhile, my friends will literally be insulted by the fact that I only got around to watching Beetlejuice this past February. But yes, the original Karate Kid, the 1984 martial arts family movie classic, was just never on regular VHS rotation in my household, so here I find myself in the year of our Lord 2025, and I'm just sort of stumbling in to watch the latest legacy sequel to a franchise that I have basically zero familiarity with, but which is certainly notable in and of itself, given that this is, technically speaking, already the third legacy sequel to the original Karate Kid trilogy, once again having no direct connection to those first three films written by Robert Mark Kamen and directed by John G. Avildsen, and coming to us some 15 years after the last time they tried to reboot this franchise, albeit with Jackie Chan supporting Jaden Smith in a standalone star vehicle that notoriously did not in fact feature any karate in it, but did considerably good international box office before a direct follow-up basically got marooned in development hell, and the limelight was all but stolen by the Cobra Kai TV show, which was in fact a direct spin-off of the original trilogy. And I haven't seen any of that stuff, so I'm honestly just walking into the newly christened Karate Kid Legends, unsullied by any nostalgia, and just approaching it as its own thing, because that's basically literally all I can do. Not that I have quite that much reason to worry, given that the very first scene of Karate Kid Legends is in fact a flashback to 1984, set against a rather uncannily realized, no doubt heavily CGI or maybe even AI-generated backdrop of the home and dojo of Mr. Miyagi, the karate master from the original trilogy, and even features what appears to be stand-in actors being employed alongside digital face and voice replacement to create a completely new scene featuring both the original Mr. Miyagi, as portrayed by the late Pat Morita, and the original trilogy's hero Daniel LaRusso, as portrayed by the younger Ralph Macchio. And which it's basically just shoehorned into the movie that, okay, so you remember how 15 years ago we made that completely unrelated film that we called The Karate Kid, but it starred Jackie Chan and it was actually about kung fu? Okay, well, here's a digitally recreated Mr. Miyagi to tell you don't worry about it, because actually Mr. Miyagi's style of karate is actually an original form that was inspired by his ancestors meeting with a Chinese kung fu master whose families shared a special kinship with each other throughout the generations, like two branches growing from one tree. So that's how we can then fast forward into the present day Beijing, and it's now suddenly not anachronistic that this movie called Karate Kid starts off in a kung fu school taught by Jackie Chan, reprising his role as Mr. Han from the 2010 film, even though he was just a retired shifu working as a mechanic in that film, apparently. We really do live in an age of such, temporal nihilism. I know that this sort of fast and loose retconning of franchises is nothing new, but even if you're only passingly familiar with the Karate Kid franchise, it doesn't get any less annoying, because despite even its titling implying some deep, trenchant connection to the legend of the Karate Kid franchise as this seminal series in popular culture that it actually turns out is somewhat revered by many martial artists for its portrayal of martial arts and its conveyance of the morality and ethics of self-defense, the spiritual and philosophical dimensions of martial arts beyond the mere expressions of force and power and control. At the end of the day, Karate Kid Legends never actually gets to the point where it feels like a movie about karate, just like with the retconning of the original films, and then with Jackie Chan's Mr. Han from the 2010 reboot itself. Right from the outset, something that could have worked perfectly well on its own, independent, standalone, family-oriented martial arts film is underserved by its contorted attempts to just jam all these anachronisms into a new film that must always be under the foot of the franchise, rather than what serves the unique interests of this story. Like, sure, the adult Ralph Macchio also ends up reprising his role from the original film, now as a karate sensei himself, but if I, as somebody who has no familiarity with, no nostalgia for the Karate Kid trilogy, if I'm watching this movie and seeing where the story goes and saying to myself, man, this all feels just a little forced, I can be reasonably confident that there's going to be some older heads out there who wore out the first 3 films on VHS who are going to be like, man, this would have just been so much better if it were just its own thing. And this is a huge blinder that I think a lot of legacy sequels get put over them when it comes to stuff like this. Like, just how you might artfully go about trying to take the frayed ends of this bedraggled franchise and make it so that its connections don't come off with this tenor of groaning floorboards in an old house. Like, maybe don't open with this shoehorned, forced opening in which a bunch of Hollywood bean counters find themselves once again spitting on a revered actor's grave by basically showing, look, we can just use state-of-the-art technology to bring him back from the dead, just so he could basically say, look, it's really okay if this movie called Karate Kid isn't even really about karate. Like, save that for later when you gotta pull Ralph Macchio back into the ring. Use the frayed, estranged connection between the films to inject a little atmosphere and maybe mystery into the proceedings. Give the lead up into Macchio's reintroduction some dramatic weight on its own that serves the purposes of this story, and not just the narrow, blatantly cynical needs of the franchise. Because honestly, the second most disappointing thing about Karate Kid Legends isn't even that it doesn't work as its own standalone film. It's actually a pretty good movie. Even I, as an unapologetic film snob, felt myself really getting into this story, albeit primarily based on a combination of the performances of the central cast, the choreography, and the rather ingenious twists that the writer Rob Lieber introduces to an otherwise formulaic martial arts coming-of-age hero's journey that really helps Legends to stand on its own, in spite of rather than in deference to the original films. The star of Karate Kid Legends is one Ben Wang, who gives a fairly outstanding emotional and physical performance as our new teenage hero Li Fong. He's a kung fu obsessed kid from Beijing who gets uprooted from the world he knows and loves when his mother, a doctor played by Ming-Na Wen, moves their family to New York and swears her son against pursuing martial arts following the tragic death of Lee's older brother at the hands of a jealous kung fu rival. But trying to take your kid out of martial arts by settling him in New York is kind of like trying to rehabilitate a neglected dog by putting it in a kennel and poking it with a stick. Hence, it isn't long before Lee runs afoul of a bully named Connor Day, played by Aramis Knight, who is himself a youth karate champion whose passion for karate has been warped by a cynical, thuggish American teacher. And Connor, of course, does not take too kindly when Lee starts getting rather chummy with his ex-girlfriend Mia, played by Sadie Stanley, so there you got the basis for a rather cliche battle of hormonal youths being rendered, as with the original film, an allegory for the philosophical and spiritual battle for martial arts as it becomes commodified for cynical ends. Except Lieber goes one step further in really retooling Karate Kid Legends into its own standalone family-oriented family-oriented martial arts saga that is, again, I found, even as someone who couldn't be less interested in the films to which it is forced to pay so much creaky homage, I found this quite compelling. Because at first, the foundational dramatic struggle of the film isn't even between Lee and Connor. It is rather that Mia's father, Victor, a retired boxer and pizzeria owner played by Joshua Jackson in what honestly turns out to be one of the most outstanding and charming performances in the film, it turns out that he's in serious debt to the very same thug who runs the karate school that Connor attends. And he ends up recruiting the young Lee to teach him kung fu so that he can use those techniques to win an underground boxing tournament. And so here I was kind of on the fence about Legends overall, and suddenly being like, oh, instead of an old master teaching some young punk, this is about a young kid inspiring and teaching a washout. Wow, this is actually really interesting. I've never seen that before, and furthermore, I could imagine being a kid watching this movie and thinking this was really cool. And this isn't just a twist that goes nowhere. Lieber, as a screenwriter, really does an excellent job of taking these parallel streams of plot. Lee's rivalry with Connor and Lee's shot at redemption by fighting through Victor, taking these parallel plots and bringing them together in a way that drives home the emotional core of the movie, all bound up in Lee's loss of his brother and his feelings of survivor's guilt and his estrangement from his mom. All of these things that, again, I'm sad to say, are a million times more engaging than anything that is attempting to tie this thing to a trilogy of films that, I must stress again, this is the third time in the last 30 years that they have tried to plunder this tomb of 80s nostalgia. The performances are strong, Lieber's script is uncommonly tight for a legacy sequel of this kind, even with all the prerequisite restrictions he's saddled with. And last but not least, the choreography for this movie in many ways comes off as more impressive than a lot of the adult-oriented action movies that have flooded the market since John Wick hit big. In particular, there's a scene in which Lee is defending Victor from a group of debt-collecting thugs from the corrupt karate dojo, where any martial arts movie fan will immediately recognize the much more impressive homage that this film pays, not to the Karate Kid franchise, but to the legacy of supporting actor Jackie Chan. There are so many nice little bits of fake out, environmental improvisation, and last but not least, emphasis on discrete moments in which you credibly humanize this Lee kid by showing him getting hurt while he's fighting, all of which are such signatures of what Jackie Chan as both an actor and choreographer had brought to martial arts movies, that you wonder why it's taken so long for a martial arts movie in recent memory to even try it. The weak link in this chain, however, is unfortunately our director in Jonathan Entwistle, primarily a TV producer and director who is coming on to helm this martial arts action film, and I'm sorry, he's just not up to snuff. What carries Karate Kid Legends is the writing, performances, and choreography, but all of that stuff ends up doing a lot of heavy lifting for what turns out to be Entwistle and cinematographer Justin Brown's lack of proper intuition about how to best serve all of these strengths that the film has, especially the fight choreography. It's not that Legends is a terribly produced or shot film, but this may lead into a larger discussion about how even the best that Hollywood has to offer in terms of contemporary action and martial arts movies is being dragged down so much by a lack of critical intuition about how best to shoot this sort of action. The way in which Legends is shot, it just has this vibe that so many major Hollywood film productions have these days of technically looking pretty, but where the prettiness is just kind of vague and unmotivated, being more reminiscent of a music video or a TV commercial than a proper film. The digital cinematography in Legends presents a world of lush, deeply saturated colors, but where the focus is always so soft that whenever Entwistle and Brown's camera has to move, the frame becomes this vague, soft blur where, especially in so many of the earlier low light and nighttime fight sequences, there just isn't a sense of crisp, clear detail in the image that you can really follow what's going on, or even get a sense of, from shot to shot, when Entwistle has to cut on action, where our attention needs to be directed. You get enough to get impressed by the fights in Legends, but just not enough to get that emotionally involved in the fights as a vehicle of storytelling. And while it's not just in the fight scenes where Entwistle's direction leaves a lot to be desired, it's certainly the area in which it's most emblematic that what is probably holding this production back so much is that there was a lot of lack of proper planning and a lot of last-minute changes behind the scenes. A perfect example comes in a scene shortly after Lee is assaulted by Connor after he catches him on the subway with Mia. Connor backhands Lee in the eye, but Lee, being the good kung fu student he is, and also heeding his mother's demands, does not fight back or take revenge for his bruised ego. And yet, the next morning, when Lee's mother confronts him about his black eye, telling him, "You promised me you wouldn't fight anymore," Lee says, "I didn't have a choice." I didn't have a choice as opposed to, I didn't fight him, I got mugged. It might just have to do with a rearranging of scene orders in editing, as Lee does get into a fight with and lose to Connor in a later scene at school. So that would make sense. Lee's mother isn't responding to the black eye, but the call she got from school. But the ordering of the scene actually seems to imply that originally Lee was supposed to fight Connor on the subway, but at some point in production or post-production or even reshoots, the folks behind the scenes realized that this didn't work thematically or wasn't true to Lee's character. And yet they still left in all the dialogue that presents it as if Lee did get into a fight with Connor on the subway. It really is a shame because for as well written, well acted, and well choreographed as Legends is, it honestly is just kind of a mess as a production. All those three previous factors go a long way in keeping you emotionally invested, but the latter weaknesses and its overall forced feeling just because it is yet another legacy reboot sequel, whatever, it holds it back just enough that I am forced to give Karate Kid Legends a favorable but charitable 3 out of 5. With that, I'm going to head out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole review, and don't be a stranger to sounding off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.